He believed the God of the Old Testament was evil. 9 years. Then he wrote the doctrine of original sin. That is not a rumor about Augustine of Hippo. It is in his own autobiography, still in print 16 centuries after he finished it. And the theology he carried out of that movement did not dissolve when he left. It settled into the foundations of Western Christianity so quietly, so completely, that most Christians today have no idea which part of the doctrine they hold most deeply was shaped inside a Persian dualist sect that predated the Roman Empire. This is the history of Augustine's 9 years inside Manichaeism, what that religion actually taught, what drew him in as a young man in Carthage, why he finally walked away, and what scholars including Peter Brown, Paula Fredriksen and Elaine Pagels have found embedded inside his most consequential theological contribution. The doctrine of original sin that your denomination, whatever it is, almost certainly still teaches in some form today. The story begins in a city most Americans have never heard of, Thagaste. It sits in what is today northeastern Algeria, in the foothills of the Aures Mountains. In the year 354 AD, it was a provincial Roman town, far enough from Rome to feel the distance, close enough to the empire to be shaped by its ambitions and anxieties. It was the kind of place where a gifted, restless young man with educated parents and a hunger for something larger than his surroundings would feel the ceiling of his circumstances pressing down on him from every direction. His father, Patricius, was a pagan Roman official of modest means. His mother, Monica, was a devout North African Christian whose faith would become one of the most documented maternal relationships in all of late antique literature. Augustine described her in his Confessions, written approximately between 397 and 400 AD, structured as a sustained address to God and a form of public self-examination, as a woman who prayed for him with such relentless persistence that he felt she wept over his spiritual condition the way most mothers weep only over physical death. Monica is one of the most fully drawn personalities in the literature of the ancient world, not because we have independent records of her, but because her son wrote about her with the granular detail that comes only from observing someone very closely for a very long time. Augustine was a student of unusual ability. His father recognized it early and arranged for him to study rhetoric in Madauros, a nearby city, and then in Carthage, the largest city in Roman North Africa, a metropolis of perhaps 300,000 people, positioned on the coast where commerce, philosophy, and competing religious movements met and argued daily. Carthage in the 4th century was intellectually alive in ways that Thagaste was not. It had theatres, legal courts, a vibrant teaching culture. And by Augustine's own account in the Confessions, Book 3, it had a sensory atmosphere that made it exactly the wrong environment for a young man already struggling with what he would later describe as the tyranny of his own desires. He arrived in Carthage at roughly 17 or 18 years old, studying rhetoric in preparation for a career in law or administration. He was among the most promising students in the city. He was also, simultaneously, at war with himself in ways that no academic distinction could resolve. He had been reading Cicero's Hortensius, a philosophical dialogue now lost to history except through ancient references and quotations. It was a summons to pursue wisdom over transient pleasure, to subordinate immediate desire to the longer life of the mind. According to Augustine in the Confessions, Book 3, Chapter 4, the text set his soul ablaze. He turned toward the search for truth in a way that nothing before it had managed. He wanted something vast enough, deep enough, to match the scale of the interior life he was already aware he possessed. He turned, as his mother had always hoped, to the Christian scriptures, and found them insufficient. Not false, insufficient. The Latin Bible available to him in Carthage was a rough translation, sometimes clumsy in its prose, dense with passages that refused to cooperate with the philosophical categories he was absorbing through his studies. The Old Testament troubled him particularly. A God who appeared to change his mind between narratives, a God who commanded the destruction of entire peoples, a portrait of divinity that shifted across texts in ways that offended the Platonic aesthetic he was developing. The God of Abraham and the God that Cicero's Hortensius pointed toward did not obviously inhabit the same universe. Into that opening walked the Manichaeans. Manichaeism was not a fringe superstition. It was one of the most organized and geographically distributed religious movements of the ancient world, founded by the Persian prophet Mani, born in 216 AD in the Babylonian region of what is today southern Iraq. Mani claimed to be the final prophet in a line of succession that included Zoroaster, the Buddha, and Jesus of Nazareth, each of whom he understood as having revealed a portion of the truth he was sent to complete. His religion had spread from Persia westward through Egypt, North Africa, Italy, and Spain, and eastward through Central Asia, all the way to China, where Manichaean temples were still standing as late as the 14th century. This was not a regional sect with limited reach. It was a genuinely global religion with sophisticated internal theology, a structured hierarchy of elect and hearers, a multilingual scriptural canon, and an intellectual culture capable of attracting the most educated Romans of the 4th century. The Manichaeans who found Augustine in Carthage were not evangelists working the street corners. They were literate, philosophically trained, comfortable in the same rhetorical culture he was being educated in. They had a precise and elegant answer to the exact problem that had just driven him away from his mother's scriptures. Their answer was this: the God of the Old Testament was not the father of Jesus. He was a lesser, malevolent power, the demiurge, the architect of the physical world, which was not a creation of goodness, but a prison constructed by darkness. The true God was pure light, pure spirit, radically transcendent, entirely untouched by the contamination of the material realm. This cosmological teaching drew from Mani's own foundational writings. According to the Cologne Mani Codex, a papyrus manuscript discovered in Egypt in the 1960s and studied extensively by scholars including Ludwig Kernen at the University of Michigan, published in critical editions beginning in 1975, Mani taught that the cosmos was the site of an ongoing war between two co-eternal principles, a kingdom of light and a kingdom of darkness. Human beings were fragments of divine light trapped inside material bodies, which were themselves constructions of the dark powers designed to perpetuate their imprisonment. The purpose of religious practice was the liberation of that captive light from the prison of flesh, a gradual cosmic process that required the organized effort of the entire Manichaean community. If that language sounds familiar to you, if it echoes something you have heard about the soul imprisoned in a sinful body, about the flesh as the enemy of the spirit, about desire as evidence of corruption rooted in the very material of human existence, you are picking up exactly the resonance that scholars like Elaine Pagels have spent decades tracing with primary sources and historical precision. But in 373 AD, Augustine did not know where this vocabulary would eventually take him. He was 18 years old, in the grip of a moral crisis he could not resolve, confronting a theological problem he had not yet found language to answer. The Manichaeans offered him the most intellectually coherent explanation for evil he had yet encountered. Why does a good God permit suffering? Because the God responsible for suffering is not the good God. Simple. Devastating. And for a mind already trained in philosophy, far more satisfying than the rough-edged scripture his mother had pressed into his hands. He joined. If what you just heard brought you up short, the architect of the theological framework most Western churches run on spent 9 formative years inside a Persian dualist cult. You are not alone in that reaction. The vast majority of people sitting in churches shaped by Augustinian theology have never been given this part of the historical record. Their pastors may not have known it. The history was there. The texts have been available for decades. Most Christians simply were never directed toward them. This channel exists for exactly that reason. To go into the history most Christians were never offered, the councils, the controversies, the early texts, and the lives of the people who made the decisions that shaped what Christianity would become and what it would leave behind. If this is the depth you have been looking for, subscribe now and turn on notifications. Every episode in this series goes further into the early church record than most Sunday sermons will ever go. And I want you to leave one word in the comments right now, just one, that describes what you felt when you heard that Augustine spent 9 years inside this movement. Not a sentence, one word. I am genuinely curious what that word is for you. Augustine was not a passive or peripheral member of the Manichaean community. He was intellectually engaged with its positions, debating Manichaean cosmology with other educated Romans, actively defending the movement in discussions. In the Confessions, Book 4, he describes himself during this period as someone who had swallowed the teaching and was actively offering it to others. His own words, not an outside critic's assessment of him. This channel carries no sponsors and no advertisers, just the research. If that matters to you, the QR code is on your screen now, and the link is in the description. The Manichaean community also gave him something beyond cosmological answers. It gave him belonging, intellectual stimulation among serious-minded people, and a moral architecture that did not demand impossible, immediate perfection. The hearers, the outer tier of the movement, were not required to live with the severe asceticism of the elect, the inner circle who had renounced food, sexuality, and material comfort entirely. The hearers were told that the divine light within them would be gradually purified across multiple lifetimes. The moral pressure was real, but distributed across a cosmic timeline. For a young man who had already failed to live the celibate life his mother had hoped for, he had taken a concubine with whom he had a son, Adeodatus, born around 372 AD. This framework offered a kind of mercy that Christianity, as he had so far encountered it, did not provide. 9 years is a long time to inhabit a cosmological framework. During that period, Augustine absorbed the Manichaean map of reality the way any serious student absorbs the assumptions of the school where they first learned to think. Not always consciously, not always explicitly, but structurally. The universe was a battleground between light and darkness. The flesh was a problem rooted in cosmic architecture, not merely personal weakness. Sexual desire was not a misuse of something good. In Manichaean theology, as documented in sources including the Kephalaia of the Teacher, a 4th century Manichaean text studied by scholars at the Free University of Berlin, sexual reproduction was the mechanism by which the powers of darkness perpetuated the imprisonment of divine light in new bodies. To conceive a child was, within this framework, to cooperate with the enemy of the light. Hold that thought. You will need it. His doubts accumulated gradually. The Manichaeans had promised that their cosmology was rationally demonstrable, not merely a matter of faith but of evidence. They had claimed, specifically, that their astronomical teaching explained the movements of stars and planets in ways that confirmed their cosmic framework. When Augustine compared Manichaean astronomical claims with what trained scientists already knew in the 4th century, the claims did not hold. The Manichaean account of celestial mechanics contradicted established astronomical data. He documents this with some specificity in the Confessions, Book 5, chapters 3 through 6. He was told to wait for Faustus. Faustus of Milevis was the most celebrated Manichaean intellectual in the Latin-speaking world. Among North African Manichaean communities, his name had circulated for years as a promised resolution to intellectual doubts. The man who could answer every remaining objection, who had engaged every challenge the movement had faced. When Faustus finally arrived in Carthage, probably around 382 or 383 AD, Augustine sought him out with genuine anticipation. The meeting was not what he expected. Faustus was charming. He was an excellent speaker, warm and gracious in conversation. But beneath the manner, he had not engaged the specific questions that had been accumulating in Augustine for years. He had read some Cicero, some poetry, some general philosophy. He had not studied the scientific and philosophical objections that Augustine needed resolved. He was honest enough to admit this, which Augustine genuinely respected. But the honesty solved nothing. The accumulated weight of years of intellectual discomfort found its final resting point in that conversation. That is when everything changed. Within a year of that meeting, Augustine left Carthage. He went first to Rome, then to Milan. The geographical departure was also the beginning of a slower withdrawal from the movement he had served for 9 years. Milan, in 384 AD, was the Western imperial capital. The city was where political power actually lived, and its bishop was a man named Ambrose, who stands as one of the most consequential figures in the history of the Western Church. Neil MacLean, writing in his 1994 study Ambrose of Milan, Church and Court in a Christian Capital, published by the University of California Press, documented how Ambrose operated simultaneously in ecclesiastical and political registers with a sophistication unusual even for his era. He had been the Roman governor of the district of Liguria before being acclaimed bishop by the Milan congregation in 374 AD, a layman baptized and ordained within a single week under popular pressure. He understood how power structures worked, and he preached with a method of biblical interpretation that Augustine had never encountered in his education or in his 9 years among the Manichaeans. Ambrose read the Bible allegorically, the morally troubling passages of the Old Testament, precisely the passages that had first driven the young Augustine away from the scriptures in Carthage, were not literal scandals requiring direct defense. They were figures, symbols pointing towards spiritual realities layered beneath the narrative surface. This tradition of reading extended through Origen of Alexandria, writing in the 3rd century, back to Philo of Alexandria in the 1st century. It was new to Augustine. What he had previously known of Christianity was the sincere, devotional version his mother practiced, genuine in its faith, but not philosophically sophisticated in the way his training demanded. Ambrose gave him something different, a way to engage the Christian scriptures with his full intelligence rather than hold that intelligence in suspension. Then something shifted the entire search. He did not convert immediately after hearing Ambrose. There were roughly 2 more years of intellectual transition, through academic skepticism, the tradition associated with Cicero's later philosophical writing, and then into Neoplatonism, specifically the writings of Plotinus, whose account of the soul's emanation from and return to the One gave Augustine a philosophical framework large enough to begin integrating what Ambrose was offering from the pulpit. The decisive moment came in a garden in Milan, in the summer of 386 AD. He describes it in the Confessions, Book 8, chapters 11 and 12. He heard what seemed to be a child's voice repeating the Latin phrase, tolle lege, take up and read. He opened the letters of Paul to the Romans. His eyes fell on Romans 13, verses 13 and 14. Not in reveling and drunkenness, not in sexual immorality and sensuality, not in quarreling and jealousy, but put on the Lord Jesus Christ and make no provision for the flesh to gratify its desires. He was baptized by Ambrose at the Easter Vigil of 387 AD, along with his son Adeodatus and his close friend Alypius. And now comes the part of the story that most accounts of Augustine's conversion leave entirely unexamined. He did not leave Manichaeism the way you empty a house. You do not remove the furniture and call the walls clean. 9 years of foundational intellectual formation do not dissolve at the baptismal font. The scholars who have spent careers inside Augustine's actual texts have been making this argument with precision and primary sources for decades. And given what we know about how theology actually develops, through the particular intellectual vocabularies available to the people doing the thinking, the argument demands to be heard. Here is where the historical record becomes genuinely unsettling for anyone who has inherited the Western Christian tradition. Peter Brown, whose 1967 biography, Augustine of Hippo, published by the University of California Press, remains the standard scholarly life, argued that Augustine's theological development cannot be fully understood without accounting for the Manichaean substrate he carried into his Christian writing. Brown is precise about this. He does not argue that Augustine remained Manichaean. He argues that certain Manichaean categories became the default coordinates of Augustine's theological imagination, present not in his explicit argument, but in the shape of the questions he thought were worth asking, in the structure of the problems he was positioned to perceive at all. Paula Fredriksen, professor of scripture at Boston University and author of Augustine and the Jews, published in 2008 by Doubleday, developed a related argument about how Augustine read Paul. The Manichaean Paul, the Paul of radical opposition between flesh and spirit, of the body as a site of darkness opposing the light of the soul, was the Paul Augustine encountered first, before Ambrose, before Neoplatonism, before his conversion. That prior encounter with Paul through a Manichaean lens, Fredriksen argues, left structural marks on how Augustine interpreted the Pauline letters for the rest of his career, including during the Pelagian controversy that would define his mature theology. How much of what the Western Church teaches about human nature came from those 9 years in Carthage? That question is harder to answer than it sounds, and it is the question at the center of everything that follows. If you want to go deeper into exactly where Augustine's writing touches the Manichaean inheritance, and where serious historians disagree about how far that inheritance actually extends, I have put together a written companion to this series, The Hidden Confessions, 7 Truths Augustine of Hippo kept from the world, and what they reveal about faith, sin, and the birth of Christianity. The link is in the first comment, and if you are watching on a screen, the QR code is there now. Elaine Pagels, professor of religion at Princeton University, whose 1988 book, Adam, Eve, and the Serpent, was published by Random House, examined what may be the most specific and consequential instance of this problem, the doctrine of original sin, and exactly where it diverged from the Christian tradition that preceded it. The question she asks is precise. Before Augustine, what did the mainstream Christian tradition teach about the fall in Genesis chapter 3? The answer surprises most Western Christians. In the Eastern tradition, represented by John Chrysostom writing in Antioch in the late 4th century in his homilies on Romans, and by Irenaeus of Lyon writing in the 2nd century in Against Heresies, the fall was not understood as transmitting a corrupted nature to every subsequent human being. What Adam passed to his descendants was mortality and the hardship of earthly life. Sin itself remained an individual act, freely committed, for which each person bore personal responsibility. The will was not understood as structurally damaged at conception. The capacity for genuine moral choice was intact. Irenaeus went further, understanding the fall not as catastrophic corruption, but as an early stumble in humanity's gradual maturation. A young species still learning to walk toward its created potential, not one permanently crippled at its first steps. Augustine changed the entire framework. His formulation, developed primarily in polemical writings against the British monk Pelagius, beginning around 411 AD, argued that through Adam's transgression, a fundamental corruption entered human nature itself. Every human being born after Adam participates in that original sin, not by imitation, but by inheritance, a corruption transmitted biologically, through the act of sexual reproduction itself. He developed this argument most fully in On the Grace of Christ and On Original Sin, written in 418 AD. Here is what Pagels documented with a precision that deserves your full attention. That specific mechanism of transmission, sin propagated through sexual union, through the act of generation itself, is structurally identical to the Manichaean account of how the powers of darkness perpetuate the imprisonment of divine light in matter. In Manichaean cosmology, sexual reproduction is not merely a physical act. It is the instrument by which the dark powers extend their dominion over the cosmos. To conceive a child is to create a new prison for a fragment of divine light. The flesh is not simply weak, it is the enemy's instrument. Augustine wrote explicitly and at length against this teaching. He was fierce in his rejection of Manichaean dualism. The Contra Faustum Manichaeum, completed around 398 AD, runs to 33 books of direct polemic against the movement he had once served. He knew the Manichaean argument from the inside. He was consciously arguing against it. But what Pagels and Brown and Fredriksen are pointing to is not his conscious intention. It is the shape of the map he was thinking with, coordinates installed during 9 years of formation that filtered into his theological imagination in ways he may not have been fully positioned to observe in himself. Then something completely unexpected happened. Pelagius pushed back. Pelagius, a British monk working in Rome in the early 5th century, read Augustine's developing theology of grace and original sin and arrived at a direct objection. If sin is inherited, transmitted through biology, embedded in the act of generation itself, then human beings are not moral agents. They are victims of a corrupted nature. And if they are victims of a corrupted nature, where is freedom? Where is responsibility? Pelagius was not arguing that human beings never sin. He was arguing that they sin freely, which means they could also freely choose otherwise. Grace, in his reading, was God's assistance to genuine human effort, not a replacement for a capacity that had been so corrupted as to be functionally absent. Augustine's response occupied nearly 2 decades of polemical writing. In On Grace and Free Will, written around 426 AD, he argued that the will inherited from Adam was not merely weakened, but fundamentally bound, capable of moving toward evil with great efficiency, incapable of moving toward genuine good without divine grace preceding and enabling that movement. The will was not free in any meaningful sense unless God first freed it. This was not pessimism for its own sake. It was, for Augustine, the only interpretation consistent with the radical dependence on grace he read in Paul's letters, experienced in the garden in Milan, and understood to be the central claim of Christian life. The church councils settled the question institutionally. The Council of Carthage in 418 AD condemned Pelagianism. The Council of Ephesus in 431 AD reinforced that judgment. The theological infrastructure of Western Christianity, Roman Catholic and Protestant alike, has run on the Augustinian account of the will, grace, and original sin for 1600 years. There is more waiting for you in this series. Every episode goes deeper into the history most Christians were never given, the councils, the controversies, the early texts, and the lives of the people who decided what Christianity would become and what it would leave behind. Subscribe now and turn on notifications so none of it reaches you late. The tradition you inherited did not arrive from nowhere. It arrived through human beings with histories, with intellectual debts, with cosmologies absorbed before they had names for them. The most extraordinary thing about Augustine of Hippo, considered from this angle, is that he knew this about himself. In the Confessions, Book 10, he examined his own mind with an honesty that remains startling 16 centuries later. He did not ask his readers to trust his theology on the basis of his authority. He showed them the mind that produced it, its failures, its formations, its debts. Martin Luther, in the 16th century, was an Augustinian friar before he became a reformer. He drew on Augustine's doctrine of grace to dismantle the Catholic soteriology, the theology of salvation, of his own era, using the tradition to challenge the institution that had canonized it. John Calvin pressed the same Augustinian framework to its logical conclusion in the doctrine of total depravity and the absolute sovereignty of divine grace. Every Protestant who has ever sat in a pew and heard a sermon about the complete corruption of human nature without grace is inside a theological framework that runs through the Reformation directly back to Augustine of Hippo. Every Catholic who has received the sacrament of baptism as the washing away of original sin is participating in a ritual shaped by his account of what that sin is and how it moves through human generations. And at the beginning of that entire chain, before the Confessions, before the Pelagian controversy, before the Easter Vigil of 387 AD, before the garden in Milan, before Ambrose opened the scripture through allegory, there were 9 years in Carthage, inside a movement that told a brilliant and restless young man that the God of the Bible was the evil God. Monica was present at her son's baptism in Milan. She had followed him across the Mediterranean. She had prayed him through 9 years inside the movement she feared and could not compete with intellectually. She watched him walk into the water. She died that same year in Ostia, on the return journey to North Africa. She did not live to see what he built from what he had carried. Augustine wrote in the Confessions, Book 1, Chapter 1, the sentence that may be the most quoted in the history of Christian devotional writing: "Our heart is restless until it rests in Thee." The question this episode leaves behind is not whether that theology is right or wrong. That is between you and your own reading of the texts, your own faith community, your own conscience. The question is simpler and more unsettling. Do you know where it came from? Augustine knew. He wrote it all down, and he left it there for anyone willing to read it honestly.